Hello and welcome to this briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Jonathan Beck, Director of Content. Our guest today is Jonathan I. Hessen. Jonathan specializes in geostrategy and security issues related to the Middle East and Europe. He's CEO of risk assessment firm Hessen Global Strategy, HGS, advising to official customers, foreign governments and the like, editor-in-chief and lead host of Jerusalem-based TV7 Israel, where he has produced over 5,000 geostrategic panels, and founding president, executive producer, and chairman of the board at Tulsa-based Truth for the Nations. Formerly, Mr. Hessen served as an advisor at the Israeli Ministry of Regional Cooperation. Hello, Jonathan, and thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.
So this morning we're going to have a different briefing, which is going to be focusing on the Gaza-Israel war and really kind of zooming in on the hostage deal in talks going on now, and about issues relating to things like the Philadelphia corridor, Netzarim corridor, and these questions which are very directly related to the war with Hamas. But as we know, after 11 months, this war has become much wider and has multiple fronts, even though many of them do not share a border with Israel. So before this briefing, we discussed about how this briefing will go, talking about the entire region. But this morning, I'd like to ask you to begin with the most, let's say, the pressing front, which is Hezbollah. Just this morning, we had a massive barrage towards Katsrin, with one person likely wounded. And this has followed 2 nights of strikes deep inside Lebanon. So can you shed some light on whether this is de-escalation, or is this just, the equation becoming more intense?
Well, one of the things that should be taken into account, and if we just focus on what happened in the last 24 hours, we can see the Israeli Air Force conducting precision strikes against Hezbollah, weapons caches, other infrastructure, including subterranean infrastructure in the Baalbek, the area of the Bekaa Valley, which is deep inside Lebanon, far beyond the so-called rules of the game that were established between the Iranian proxy Hezbollah and Israel for quite some time now. Nevertheless, the intensification of those projectiles being launched from Lebanon towards Israel includes a variety of different types of projectiles, be they medium range rockets, as well as shoulder-propelled anti-tank missiles, as well as the unmanned aerial vehicles, different types that, of course, with a short trajectory, pose a challenge, as has been publicly made available to Israel's aerial defense array. Nevertheless, the escalation dominance, how we define it, is still in line with low intensity warfare. It's not necessarily beyond the bounds of what we may call as high intensity warfare. And therefore, I do not see this necessarily as a projection towards full-scale escalation. Nevertheless, we are before the pledge by Hezbollah to launch a severe attack against Israeli targets for the targeted killing of Said Mohsen roughly 2 weeks ago. And of course, within that context, Israel continues to degrade Hezbollah's infrastructure as much as possible and establish parameters that will grant it a better starting point to a potential escalation in the event that that may happen. Now, Hezbollah on its part is probing the various Israeli defenses. It continues to do so. It tries to establish different compositions of various types of munitions in order to see how it can potentially frustrate Israel's aerial defense array. And this is pretty much what we're seeing right now on a higher scale, and therefore room for miscalculation obviously is also intensifying within that context.
Can you tell me regarding the Israeli strikes, like deep in Lebanon? So this has like 2 components. One of them is kind of striking deeper in a more like sensitive area, which has a sort of psychological effect of deterrence, perhaps against Hezbollah. The other thing, though, is the actual identity of the targets. We keep being told, you know, weapons depot and arms depot. Are these also targets that are looking forward to like degrading, you know, I don't know how to say this, core capabilities, or is this just a drop in the ocean and just like hitting them a bit, and then obviously these are not like, you know, blank targets, but are they like very high quality targets? Like what's the deciding factor in going to Bekaa Valley? The fact that it's there or the identity of the target, would you say?
Well, it's a combination of both. Obviously, the deeper you go into Lebanon, the more you stretch that red line of the rules of engagement on both sides, what is normalized in light of the latest developments. Hezbollah obviously has its strategic munitions located in three separate locations within Lebanon that are not necessarily south of the Litani River. That's why it's quite interesting to see how the IDF is dealing with that within the confinement of the various rules of engagement. Nonetheless, we do see, due to the rise in the ladder of the escalation dominance, the IDF opt to strike specifically more value targets, be they the continued regular attacks against terror operatives in the various areas of south of the Litani River in particular, but also north of the Litani River. We see specific weapons caches that are of more value. Also, potentially, there were some public statements that alluded to the fact that it had to do with subterranean infrastructure housing such strategic weaponry in the last 48 hours. So we do see a certain escalation also in the type of targets that's being focused on. Nevertheless, we do not see any critical infrastructure or civilian targets being dealt with, be they even for logistical capacity of transiting munitions, for instance, from Syria into Lebanon. We still don't see those type of attacks. So we are still below, again, maintaining a certain low intensity warfare rather than high intensity that allows both sides to potentially also de-escalate were potentially such an agreement between Israel and the Islamist Hamas to materialize in Doha, in Al Alamein, or wherever they may ultimately sign that document. It will potentially allow Hezbollah to de-escalate and recalibrate and recalculate its further steps.
Okay, thank you for this. Let's take a bit of a wider look. I don't know in what order to do this. Let's look at Yemen and the Houthis. We had a lot of news coming from you know, interferences with ships in the Straits of the Red Sea, and then and many attacks against Eilat. And then there was one attack which claimed one life in Israel, and then Israel carried out a massive strike against the Hudson port. At least the Israeli media since then has been quite quiet on this. And can you tell us where this war between Israel and the Houthis is standing at this moment?
So Israel, when it comes to the Houthis, is predominantly focused on intelligence sharing with the Five Eyes, with its partners and allies that are operating as part as Task Force 153 of Operation, the Task Force Operation Prosperity Guardian, they call it. The attacks against maritime shipping continues in a joint, of course, operation that is separate from that specific task force, which is exclusively focused on defensive measures against strikes against maritime shipping in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden, adjacent waterways also that have significance on a strategic capacity. The operation currently being led by the United States in concert with Britain as an offensive tool as well, allocating a couple of aircraft for degrading the Houthi or Ansar Allah capabilities in the shorelines of Yemen and also deep inside Yemen with a number of strikes to degrade various munitions that are already on the tarmac, ready to be utilized for various attacks against either maritime shipping, but also against U.S. partners and allies in the Middle East. So this is an ongoing operation. I don't really see a good answer from NAVCENT, the command, the CENTCOM command, basically for the Fifth Fleet, that has been really struggling with providing a clear answer to this issue within the mandate and the parameters of the mandate currently granted to it. So I'm still questioning to what degree this is going to evolve into something successful. The Wall Street Journal just reported yesterday that there was a certain arrangement between Iran and its various proxies, particularly in Yemen, Ansar Allah, which is dominated by the Houthi tribe, and the Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq, to intensify attacks against U.S. forces and U.S. led coalition forces throughout the region, something that we should take note of. Another point that should be taken note of with regard to the Red Sea is the latest arrangement made between President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and his Somalian counterpart to deepen military cooperation. As we know, the efforts by the Iranian proxy in Yemen to abruptly thwart maritime shipping through Bab el-Mandeb has had the most severe consequences to the Egyptian economy. And therefore, Egypt is trying to maneuver on different ways. Excuse me. Do you hear me? We're good?
Yeah, I hear
Okay,
you.
good. So it's been trying to maneuver in collaboration with various countries on the western shores of the Bab el-Mandeb and the various adjacent waterways to try and establish more pressure on the Iranian proxy. Of course, recently also we saw that the Biden administration has green-lighted once more the sale of offensive weaponry to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which may also once again utilize strong power to establish friction with this Iranian proxy. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what Hamad bin Salman in Saudi Arabia will ultimately decide with regard to those activities, particularly now with the U.S. elections in the United States. It's still, everybody are very careful in maneuvering in light of what it may ultimately spell for the future of the Middle East.
Okay, thank you for this. Can you tell me regarding, there's talk of maybe a Israeli Saudi Arabian deal coming, and everyone says it hinges, on what happens in Gaza and the fate of the Palestinians, etc. Does this clash between Israel and the Houthis in Yemen kind of bring the sides closer in the sense of the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Because Saudi Arabia has been getting headaches from them for like, I don't know, 10 years maybe, or maybe less, but a long time now.
So broadening the strategic collaboration with Saudi Arabia overtly by normalizing relations in a manner that would also allow for a lot more economic ventures together do not necessarily frustrate collaborations on the military front under the umbrella of Central Command, the United States for that matter. I do not see any normalization prior to January 20th between Riyadh and Jerusalem. I just don't see that materialize in any way for a long list of reasons. Also, one of which is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia does not necessarily forget. And despite having managed to improve relations with the Biden administration during the latter half of this administration's tenure in the White House, it still has a clear memory of the manner in which in February of 2021, Joe Biden came out and announced an abrupt end to offensive activities against the Houthis and the support of the Saudi-led coalition at the time that was making quite significant gains, particularly the militias under the control of the United Arab Emirates, the Giants Brigade, Tawil Brigades, or they define them in Arabic, but ultimately it remembers that. It remembers that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken conducted the revocation of the FTO designation of Ansar Allah back in the day. So it will not necessarily jump into a free gift giving to the Biden administration when it comes to relations with Israel, particularly. Nonetheless, Riyadh understands full well that in order to withstand Iran's strategy in the region, not only in Yemen, but also in Iraq, also in Syria and elsewhere, it will have to deepen its collaboration with Israel, potentially to widen or broaden the Abraham Accords, which are all within that same boat of pragmatic nations that seek to push back on Iran's efforts and aspirations to export its revolution, so-called, throughout the Middle East as a stage one or a phase one within its broader strategic calculation.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Do you want to now maybe speak to say a few words about actually Iran itself? You know, in the invitation to this briefing, we opened with Khamenei's tweet about like a 9-point plan for Israel's destruction. These 9 points are not operative. They're saying, you know, what should be here, it's kind of a, let's say it's kind of an ideological plan more than a pragmatic mode of action, but still, this is their ideological vision. So in this war, since October 7, can you say if anything changed, let's say, in their move from ideology to implementation, so to speak?
Well, the ideology works in parallel to the implementation of a certain strategy of a policy. You know, right on May 28th of 2024, earlier this year, before the inauguration, or actually during the inauguration of the 12th Parliament in Iran, the Majlis, we heard the Speaker of the Parliament come out and say that the two core principles of Iran's foreign policy includes the development of relations with neighboring countries and the ousting or the expelling of American hegemonism, as they put it, from the Middle East, something that they've, of course, identified as the core threat to the survivability of the regime, in context with, of course, remembering the power disparity between the United States and Iran, between its allies and partners under U.S. auspices. The Iranians have a very difficult time to really implement if there is a vigorous White House that is willing to engage in friction with the Iranians. And therefore, their activities have been quite focused on establishing or preparing the ground, so to speak. The first thing, because it's practically failed on the cultural level to spread its hegemonism or hegemony throughout the Middle East. Of course, the Sunnah countries are not very eager to have the 12er Shiite Islam spread in their own countries. And therefore, they have been applying pressure points that the Iranians applied within the strategy that was devised by Qasem Soleimani, who was killed, of course, in a drone strike by the Americans at the time, alongside the leader of one of the most potent Iranian proxies, namely Kataib Hezbollah, who was led by Al-Muhandis at the time. So if we really look into the various pressure points, we know that the most potent Iranian force is Hezbollah in Lebanon. We know the reason for that. If Iran ever, according to assessments of the intelligence community, if Iran seeks to break out to a nuclear weapon, a nuclear device, one or more, it will utilize Hezbollah as a deterrent power, and therefore it is not eager to utilize Hezbollah in high-intensity war that may basically sacrifice this strategic cornerstone within its grand strategy. The three other elements that are quite well known: Ansar Allah, the tribe that dominates this terror organization in Yemen, the Houthis have been quite active on not only applying pressure against maritime shipping, Saudi Arabia, the Bahrainis, and others in the region, but have been also deepening relations with other tribes in Yemen in order to broaden and really become the most strong force, not only in Yemen, but beyond. So they're really looking at broadening their horizon there. Then we have Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, as they're termed in English, a constellation of roughly 67 militias, out of which 46 are affiliated directly with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Very powerful. There is somewhat of an interesting relationship there, because on the one hand, they are backed by Iran. They receive their directives from Iran, which is more of a, we say in Hebrew, gvulot gizra, a general term of what Iran expects of it, and then they have the freedom to operate within those spectrums. And then we have also in Syria the Zainibiyun brigades and Fatimiyun brigades for the purpose of intensifying their strategic footprint. The other militias that operate in Syria operate in support of particularly the Assad regime, so they're not necessarily there for the strategic scope of pushing out the United States and its allies and partners from the region, particularly also Israel. But when we look at the Zainibiyun brigades and Fatimiyun brigades, they were actually established roughly 1-2 months after the tweets that you set up of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And the intelligence community has been studying that tweet quite vigorously, trying to identify, okay, why did he identify the West Bank as an option of becoming an underbelly, so to speak, for the state of Israel in order to annihilate the state of Israel? The focus of Israel, of course, as part of the Mabam, the campaign between the wars, was to degrade Iranian capacity to entrench militarily in Syria first and foremost, and to transit weaponry and significant precision-guided weaponry from Iran through Iraq into Syria, and then from there to specifically Lebanon, in order to, of course, intensify and ratchet up or bolster the arsenal of precision-guided munitions in Lebanon. And now, if we look at that whole scheme of things and the strategic points, that aimed to accommodate also the Gaza Strip, which was also within the scope, and subsequently the intelligence community came to the understanding that Gaza was indeed not only supported fiscally, but also beyond that, in order to prepare also in collaboration with other potent forces that are operating at Iran's behest in the region. And since 2014, what was unveiled was a very robust smuggling network from Syria through Jordan into the Jordan River, from there into particularly the northern Samaria region, where the clans there are known to be less loyal to Fatah and have been more close to Islamist organizations, including the Islamist Hamas. And they've been operating on that front to try and buy clans to support them, and to grant them also weapons to try and spread that and establish terror networks throughout that area. Now, what's interesting is that the way during the Trump administration to counter all of that was to establish the Abraham Accords. And then we saw that much of the relations that were established alongside the maximum pressure campaign, alongside other activities that were conducted at the back end and covertly were very effective in diminishing Iranian sway over the various proxies and not having enough funds. They were doing telemarathons to try and force, or not force, but convince their own people and constituents throughout the Middle East to support them. Ironically, the majority of the money came from countries in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. So that was quite also a wake-up call for European and American intelligence agencies in identifying exactly who and what and where they need to apply their own pressures in order to curtail those activities by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. But all in all, if we look at the spectrum that the Iranians have been applying, we see also that if we remember this Debocil summit back in 2002, when at the time Foreign Minister Yair Lapid invited all his counterparts from Egypt, from Morocco, from the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to visit initially in Egypt. Then they traveled to Sde Boker and they had the famous summit. On the same day, there was a major terror attack in Israel. Now, that was the paradigm shift, basically, which triggered Operation Wastebreaker, which for a couple of years the IDF basically utilized in collaboration and close coordination and collaboration with the ISA or the Shin Bet and also the Israeli border police special operators of the Yamam unit to really degrade Iranian capacity of bolstering and flooding the West Bank with weapons. And so we saw that evolve into something quite intensive with thousands of suspected terror operatives apprehended. Many of them were released when they were identified as no threat, or there are different considerations, of course, of the security establishment. But there was an active effort to counter Iranian entrenchment in the northern Samaria area in particular, but also throughout Judea and also the Jordan Valley. We saw that also intensify over a period of time. And then the threats coming out of both Lebanon and the Gaza Strip about countering that with a dramatic or severe attack was quite deliberate prior to the October 7th events. We saw the events of October 7th were practiced, were actually maneuvered multiple times before it took place, both in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon. We remember the meetings that were held by Hassan Nasrallah together with the Iman Moghni and other people who were involved in preparations for something that ultimately culminated on October 7th. But that was basically the development. The attack from the Gaza Strip aimed to prevent total defeat of Hamas in Judea and Samaria, and a total defeat of the Iranian strategy in the West Bank. And that was one thing. Then Hezbollah entered the war on October 8th in order to counter Israel's capacity from unleashing all of its power on the Gaza Strip in order to basically split the forces. So we saw roughly two divisions on the north, with the 98th Division, which is currently operational in Khan Yunis, operating on the northern front. We saw those activities being quite effective from Hezbollah's perspective to limit the capacity. And they were hoping at the time that international pressure would thwart Israel from completing the job vis-a-vis Hamas. Then on the northern front, we saw that Israel was starting to degrade military infrastructure of Hezbollah. So on the 17th of October, the Houthis entered into the fold. And all of this is basically pressure points that the Iranians have pre-planned, have organized, have really exercised, and now we're seeing the culmination of that. This is the brains of Qasem Soleimani in practical way basically being implemented throughout the region.
Okay, thank you very much for this detailed explanation. So, by the way, as we were speaking right now, there was a barrage of at least a dozen projectiles toward the area of the Golden Heights, and this is the second time this morning. So I want to ask, I mean, this is we're kind of running out of time here. I'm going to ask my last question, then I'm going to pass on a question from one of the reporters on the line. What I want to ask is, so the idea of, we can say degraded Hamas, yeah. I mean, the hostages are there, but like one finger of this hand of Iran is basically severed, so to speak. Yeah, their abilities are degraded. Now with Hezbollah, after 10 months and all the strikes back and forth, um, I asked you this in our preliminary conversation, but I want to kind of, where does Hezbollah stand in relation to how beholden it is to Iran and how much is it a representative of Lebanon? Will it always sacrifice Lebanese infrastructure and hundreds of its fighters, etc., on command from Iran, or does it have its own say in this or interest? And when you, after you answer that, if you can just tell me about the recent tunnel city that we saw. I know that it's not new, but the clip came out and it's been making the rounds. So how serious is this as a threat, or has Israel known about this all along?
So I'll focus initially on the first question, and that is when there are a couple of schools of thought on this, and of course the level of loyalty is always a question mark because ultimately the Shiite community in Lebanon is beholden to Hezbollah, but it's also beholden to certain villages, to Amal, particularly under the leadership of Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri. The understanding here in Israel is that Hassan Nasrallah is the top advisor of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei when it comes to Israel and when it comes to Lebanon. So he is part of the Ayatollah regime in Tehran. Now, he will not place himself necessarily in a position where he would advise something that would not grant him and his clans and the clans of his family and affiliates and supporters total defeats without the capacity to reemerge out of it. He also said so, and following the 2006 31-day war with Israel, that it was a mistake. He miscalculated what Israel was prepared to do in order to degrade Hezbollah in Lebanon, and he asked also for forgiveness to a certain degree from the Lebanese people for what happened. So he's beholden to both. Now we need to understand that opposed to Hamas, where the operatives that are affiliated to Hamas are parts of all clans pretty much throughout the Gulf of Trip, Lebanon is sectarian. And by this composition of its social construct, Hezbollah also needs to understand that if it's degraded to a point where it will be weaker following a full-fledged confrontation with Israel, then the Maronites, then the Sunnah, and the Druze in Lebanon, he will be exterminated for all the atrocities that he has committed against the other sects within Lebanon. Exterminated is maybe a strong word, but Lebanon has a history of conducting its affairs in a very deliberate manner, and this is just a diplomatic way of putting it. So he needs to understand that, to keep that in the back of his mind. Nonetheless, again, he's part of the establishment in Iran, and therefore, when he advises the Iranians, he's very closely in tune with what Israel is saying, with what Israel is operating, with the understanding also of the power disparity that is between Israel and Hezbollah. And therefore, he also needs to maneuver within that. We need to remember, under IDF Chief of General Staff, the previous, Kochavi, They managed to thwart Hezbollah from entrenching also in Syria in the same fashion that was done in Lebanon. This is at least the latest public information that we know. I hope that the intelligence community is on top of things still. But nonetheless, so he still needs to remember all of that. In the event that Hezbollah attacks Israel in a fashion that may draw a tit for tat situation that ultimately the prospects of miscalculation are intensified, he may this will be an Iranian decision that has been made together with him. It's not just going to tell him, okay, go and destroy yourself. So again, there is a clear line between the two sides. Now, with regard to your second question, um, I will say this very carefully because I think that the intelligence community in Israel has been humbled by the atrocities committed against Israel on October 7th, and the miscommunication with one body of the intelligence community with another, with the government, with all of this is currently being investigated, so I don't want to go into there. Nevertheless, the allocated funds to contend with Hezbollah and Iran are far superior to those that have been allocated to contend with Hamas. And by saying that, there was no conception, so to speak, of what Hezbollah may or may not do, and therefore the intelligence focus on Hezbollah has been robust for years. It's seen as a greater threat to Israel than a threat from Iran proper. But also, in the event that Hezbollah attacks Israel directly in a high intensity war, it doesn't mean that Israel will not also deal with Iranian targets. And this is something that may be in the pipelines of discussions right now. Nonetheless, the subterranean infrastructure, I saw reports about the North Korean involvement and all kind of reports that had to do with that. From my sources and people within the higher ranks of the intelligence community in Israel, there is a question mark about the depth of North Korean involvement in this story. Nonetheless, they were quite aware of all of the subterranean infrastructure in the north. They have been following it distinctly. Even when reports of residents of northern Israel raising the alarm about hearing digging underground, for subterranean infrastructure, I can say that Israel was aware of what was happening. Of course, it has considerations of what to unveil that it knows and what to make public for operational considerations and other considerations as well. We also need to take into how do you say, into the I'm sorry.
Limited liability, I'm guessing, potentially.
Right, sure. So yeah, we need to take this into somewhat of a question mark and establish a question mark about the capacity of Hezbollah to really maintain those subterranean infrastructures in a full-fledged confrontation with Israel. Don't forget that the topography, the geography of Lebanon is very different than the Gaza Strip. So all of that is also things that we need to take into account. If you destroy there something, that's solid rock that you're destroying, as opposed to dirt and earth that is in the Gaza Strip. So there are other equations that need to be taken into account.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much for that. I have to say it personally. I think I find the strategy of tunnels odd because it's an unmovable asset that takes a lot of investment to build, and it can only be a surprise once. But you know, okay. I thank you very much for this briefing, and I just remind our viewers that this evening at 8 p.m. local time, we have another briefing with Dr. Raya about the Gaza war and the hostages, etc. Again, thank you, Jonathan Hessen, for your time. And
My pleasure.
I hope to meet you again sometime soon in the future. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.